Well, the president of Cyprus vowing to launch a criminal investigation into how liable the country's banks were in the crisis. But are they really to blame? Here to weigh in, Neil Weinberg, the editor-in-chief of American Banker, and Jenice Malecki, a securities attorney. Neil, I'm going to start with you. You know, there's conversation tonight that maybe the banks are guilty of some kind of criminal violation, discussions about whether they'll go after a criminal probe in this case. Do you think that's warranted?
I don't know if it's warranted specifically, but obviously it's not going to get the money back. It might make people feel better, but it still doesn't solve the macroeconomic problems here.
Jenice, what do you say?
Well, I would say that a criminal investigation in a banking fraud, if it was a scandal such as that, is going to be helpful because I think it could help reinstall some of the integrity in the banking system if people fear criminal prosecution.
But what is the big crime here? I mean, essentially they created a marketplace where people all over the country could put their money in. Is that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. Obviously, they were trying to create a big banking center, so you offer people good rates, and then you have to invest the money somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of it went into Greek bonds, Jerry. That didn't turn out so well, so they lost money. And being stupid is not a crime.
Yeah, not the last time I looked, that's for sure. You know, this reminds me so much of the U.S. during the financial crisis, right? The government got involved, a lot of conversation about whether the banks did things that were wrong, and of course, big discussion about whether the banks should be broken up. Should they be smaller? Are they too big? What do you say, Jenice?
I do think that the banks are too big. I think that, you know, with the Graham-Liley Act had taken away the Glass-Steagall, regulation that allowed banks and brokerages to remain separate. And I believe that it would be difficult to break them up at this point, but it would be...
But you think it's a good idea to reduce their size. Neil, do you agree? Would it get rid of some of the risky behaviors that we saw during the financial crisis?
I don't think that's the core of the risky behaviors there, Jerry. If you look at some of our past financial crisis, savings and loans were small, long-term capital management, a hedge fund no one had ever heard of. It suddenly was threatening our whole financial system. It's not a question of too big to fail. It is a question of too interconnected. Nobody knows all the risks in our system. It's too complicated, and the regulators can't get their arms around it.
You know, the Attorney General just said recently, in front of a lot of people, he was on the record, that he can't regulate these banks. It's impossible for him to bring any kind of prosecution. It seems to me that it would be impossible to make the banks smaller as well. Jenice?
Well, I think that it's the same problem. If you try to make it smaller, then you're going to need twice the regulators to investigate and audit and review two different banks instead of one bank, and the government is already stretched, not able to have enough regulators to staff to review all the banks.
The last thing I think we can stand is more regulation. I mean, Neil, the people who've really taken it on the chin are not the big banks, but the small banks that are going out of business and can't bear the weight, the scrutiny of all this new regulation.
Absolutely. And the problem is if the small banks go by the wayside, they only have about 10% of the deposits, but they have 40% of the loans to small business. And that's, of course, where the growth comes from.
And that's the economy right there.
Absolutely.
You know, remember the London whale and J.P. Morgan and all the problems associated with the big loss there? Jenice, do you see that as a threat to the system, or was this just something people got upset about because the dollar figures were so big?
Well, I think it's a threat because I think there's not enough supervision and compliance in these broker-dealers and banks. And I think that if there's not enough staffing, and they're not well respected because they're not really as well paid as the higher-up bankers, the commissioned salespeople, and so nobody listens to them. So this is a huge problem.
But come on, all we've done is hire compliance people for the last decade. Is the system still broken, Neil?
The system is still broken because you can't micromanage these banks from Washington. What you need to do, I think I agree with you, Jenice, is you need to come up with some really strict penalties and go after individuals. But to break up the big banks doesn't make sense because that's not where all the risk is. As I said, the risk is in the system. And the other thing is, do we want to compete with the Chinese and the Europeans? Do we want to be only using their banks? If we want to export,
I am hoping that American banks will lead the way for the next century. And they can't be tiny to do that. Jenice, what do you say?
But the size makes it the powerful figure that it is. And so when you've got so much power and you've got so many friends and lobbyists in government, it's hard to get a strict regulatory system. I mean, they're always trying to ease the regulations.
The banks are bigger than the government.
I mean,
too big to fail, too big to jail, too big to manage, too big to regulate, and too big to take on politically. And that is an issue, but it doesn't mean that just breaking them up and going back to where we were in the 70s with 18,000 inefficient banks, that's not the answer.
We were doing well during the Clinton administration until he actually repealed
We were doing well during the Clinton administration?
Well, unfortunately, you don't always have sync up good times and good policy. Sometimes there's a lag of a few years.
Well, I've got a long way to go, that's for sure. I don't think anybody's happy with the system the way it is, because as you say, they are too big to bail, and they are certainly too big to fail. Thanks to both of you for coming on tonight. Fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right, when we come back, a small